Scripts.
I'm going to share our slide.
Oh, one more. All right, this is Florida Civics Literacy Exam, competency 4, landmark decisions. This is our last one of the semester. We will probably start up. Somebody already asked me today when we were going to start next semester. I told them look towards the end of January. We'll probably do it much like we did this one every 3 weeks. So if you missed the previous 3 competencies, we'll just start back over at the beginning sometime in January. All right, that's all I have to say on that slide. Okay, these are your 4 competencies. We've already talked about the first 3. And today we'll be on the 4th, landmark Supreme Court cases, legislation, and executive actions. Let's say same thing again with pretty pictures.
Yeah, so this one, yeah, understanding of landmark Supreme Court cases. Oh, yeah, legislation, landmark.
Yeah, and so we have the Supreme Court, Capitol, and the White House. Okay, so
I thought it was this one, landmark cases. Big question, what is a landmark case? You all know what a landmark is. If I don't know where your house is, I say, what's your landmark? And it's an important place to designate where you're at. Here, a landmark case is one that the people in the future use to determine new ideas. That's why it's significant. And I thought it was interesting to give you an example of a landmark case when this was one of the first. This is the one that gave the Supreme Court their own power of judicial review. Inside the Constitution, it is not there, which is amazing. It's not there. So this is a major one, Marbury versus Madison, 1803. So sometimes I can't remember in the beginning. You have to know who's Madison, how long ago was it? And you could kind of remember this is what case this is. I think it's one of the first on the list that they recommend you know. So I just did that.
one of the things that's important to know about these, is particularly Supreme Court cases, because these are Supreme Court cases, is that they change the way the Constitution is interpreted. That's what a landmark Supreme Court case does. It says we used to kind of think the Constitution said this, but this is what the Constitution really says and really means. Okay, go ahead.
Now we have landmark legislation. Now, one of the things to watch, this came straight from the page that tells you what you're going to be tested on. It tells you to look for these areas: conflicts and compromise, territorial expansions and structure of functional government, expansion or restriction of civil rights. See, both expansion or restriction.
And we're going to look at some examples of both of those.
Yeah, and then expansions or restrictions of social programs. We're going to look at that. Environmental protection, and then expansions of presidential and war powers. And these examples, and this is in your handout. Go ahead. You want to go with landmark?
Okay, so landmark executive decisions. It is an executive decision. Now we're looking at the 3 branches of government makes the decisions. The Supreme Court decision, that's obviously decided by the Supreme Court. A legislative decision is a law that is passed through the legislature. A landmark executive decision is when the president, I'm just going to say this is how it is. Okay, so landmark executive actions to be familiar with involve efforts at foreign policy. So treaties, things like that, there's things the president has said. Territorial expansion, things like the Louisiana Purchase was actually an executive action. Restrictions or expansions of civil rights, once again. We're going to look at both restrictions, things like Japanese American internment was an executive action, but so was DACA, what we call the DREAM Act. So these are expansions and restrictions of civil liberties. The use of executive orders, military desegregation, affirmative action, the presidential bully pulpit, advocacy for various programs and reforms, particularly in the 20th and 21st centuries. The president can't make legislation, but he can encourage legislation, he can advocate for legislation, and then presidential war powers. All right, so we've broken this up by year. We decided, instead of doing a whole list of legislation and a whole list of executive actions and a whole list of Supreme Court decisions, we've done it in 50-year chunks to kind of show, because the things go together. Executive actions affect Supreme Court decisions, affect what laws are passed. So we've lumped them together chronologically.
Yeah, and notice here, Supreme Court decisions, 0. So that's why I was saying we didn't get to
Right.
the first one yet.
Because 1803 is when they gave themselves permission to affect law. And so that had not happened yet. So this is right at the beginning, 1750s, before we even are the United States. You had the Declaration of Independence and the Revolutionary War. You had the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. We are not going to talk much about the Bill of Rights because we had talked about it extensively in other sessions. You have some legislation that's passed, and you'll notice things get weighted more towards other things at different times. But at the beginning, it was mostly going through the legislature. The Northwest Ordinance, the Judiciary Act, the Alien and Sedition Act. All right. Do you want me to talk about this one?
Yeah.
Okay. So the Alien and Sedition Act, one of the trends you'll notice, and it goes all the way, I noticed it on the first slide we did, on the last slide we did. When the country is in trouble, civil rights shrink. In times of peace, civil rights expand. This is a trend you will notice all the way through. So right here in 1798, we'd only been a country for like 5 minutes. And we were thinking, and there was a fear that aliens, as we called foreigners back then, might side with France instead of with this new United States. And so we passed a law, or 4 laws, collectively known as the Alien and Sedition Act. And these did things like raise how long somebody had to be in the country before they were considered a resident. It permitted the arrest, imprisonment, and deportation during wartime. The Sedition Act made it a crime for American citizens to print, order, or publish any false, scandalous, or malicious writings. So this was the first time our national identity was sort of threatened, and it was the first time we put in laws that restricted freedom.
Oh, I thought we did it.
About that, we thought we had it on. All right. So,
Okay, now it's on. I
Yeah.
thought we did have it on.
yeah.
Okay. So now we're going to another section of years. Notice we're doing this by 50 years. 50 years might not be the perfect match. You could look at your textbooks that divides them maybe a little bit differently. But you notice on the last 2 slides, they had Judicial Act. Look at 1801, you have Judicial Act again. And it's not too long by 1803 that the Supreme Court got their power. But that isn't the one I wanted to focus on. I wanted to focus directly on westward expansion, because territory expansion is one of the areas they want you to focus on. And so as we look at this, I took out the other things. Look at how many things are left that literally had to do with expansion. Now, some of these don't directly look like, oh, how can they belong? Like Missouri Compromise, if you know anything about that, it does have to do with land. Adams-Onis, which is also called the Southwest Territorial Act. It is where we got Florida in the US. Yay! Yeah, it was 1890, so it was coming. Indian Removal Act, Louisiana Purchase, these are executive orders. But this bank stuff and this federal trade stuff, what in the world does that have to do with the land and territorial? And it has a lot to do with it, but we wouldn't think about it unless you look at these things in context of history. What was happening at this point? They were building canals, stagecoaches, and the railroad. This was a real game changer. So as they had this railroad being built, one of the states, Maryland, wanted to have their own power for a steamboat, and they had a monopoly on it. And the federal government says, interstate commerce belongs to the federal government, and therefore a company like Maryland can't have the monopoly on the steamboat companies. And that could have happened with railroads, that could have happened with canals, stagecoaches. I know we don't use stagecoaches, but you could imagine California having the one company for all trucks. And what would that do to the whole trade and in the US? So that's what happened. That's why it's related, because how do you think these people were going out west? How did the West grow? The railroad was one of the biggest items to do it. But before that, we had the steam, the steam engine and the stagecoaches and the canals. But that's a different story. So it makes sense, I hope.
All right, one of the unfortunate consequences of Western expansion was the Indian Removal Act. And the Indian Removal Act was signed into law by President Andrew Jackson, authorizing the president to grant lands west of the Mississippi in exchange for Indian lands within existing state borders. A few tribes went peacefully, but many resisted the relocation policy. During the fall and winter of 1838 and 1839, the Cherokees were forcibly moved west, and this led to what has been known as the Trail of Tears. And so you've probably heard of the Trail of Tears, but this was an actual act by Congress that was signed by Andrew Jackson. So these are the kind of things you need to be attention to in context. Westward expansion, we're moving the country west, and we have to get rid of those pesky people who already live there. And so that is what this act was about.
And now we have the same thing, 1815 to 1899. We have broad areas. The American Civil War is the biggest thing within this period. I think there were two. I think I deleted them.
Okay, yeah, Westward. I think Westward expansion was still on there.
Yeah,
maybe.
I deleted one by accident. But this one, what you're going to notice the most is civil rights issues. Civil rights issues. It happened, and it's no surprise after the Civil War, that is what the big thing was. And it started with, and you notice I put some in red and I put some that I left some black. I did that because the ones in red, we always didn't make good decisions, like the removal of Indian Act. I don't think that was a good decision when we look back. Same thing, suspension of habeas corpus. Now that happened at a certain time, 18. This was the Civil War. They were worried about people and they took away people's rights, and they were trying people that maybe they were Confederate soldiers and now they wanted to be in government, they wanted to have power, but they were high power influencers. They didn't want that power to be there. They took away their rights.
It also had to do with the draft. They wanted to draft people, and they wanted to say, you don't get a say in this. You get to go, you go in the military. So
yeah, and then you see the two Supreme Court, Dred Scott versus Stanford. I saw that as being negative. Free slaves are not citizens. Halsey versus Ferguson, separate but equal, I saw as being negative. At the time, that one they said wasn't, but we know we can never make separate but equal. So we're going to give some examples of these.
Okay, so the Emancipation Proclamation. I think I was a full-grown adult before I realized that the Emancipation Proclamation was an executive action and not a legislative action. But it was President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation proclamation, January 1st, 1863, as the nation approached its third year of the Civil War. The proclamation declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states, this is an important part to remember, are henceforward to be free. Okay, so as a war move, the war was still going on in 1863. As a war move, Abraham Lincoln declared the slaves in the rebellious states to be free. Will you go back a slide, Jamie?
Sure will. I think I do. Oops, maybe you have to do it on the. Oh, wait, there
There
it
we
is.
go.
I found it.
Okay, so you'll notice that there were a whole that's passed about former slaves, abolition of slavery, citizenship for former slaves, voting for all male citizens. But the Emancipation Proclamation was a necessary first step in the freeing of those slaves. So, like we've repeatedly said, context, all of this goes together.
Next one. I just like this one, the Pendleton Act. I liked it because it was a civil rights act that I could associate with. It provided the federal government jobs be awarded on the basis of merit and that the government employees be selected through competitive exams. And this way it allowed the most competent to get the job and not somebody that was a good old boy. And so this was a big move at the time. I wish we would still do this kind of thing. I think we tried to, but we don't always see it. I'm going to take this.
All right, moving into the 20th century. We are barreling through American history here, boys. Okay, moving into 1900. There was a lot going on at the beginning of the 20th century. We had two world wars, 1817 to 1819, and then World War II, 1941 to 1945. And then in the middle of that, the Great Depression, 1929 to 1941. And you will see a lot of laws that deal with both the wars and the Depression. You will see Supreme Court decisions that deal with the wars. And somehow in the middle, we get vote given to women. Yay!
The federal income tax, I think they ended up needing
Because of the wars. Yeah.
So it kind of related.
Yeah.
So as we look at this, kind of look at U.S. involvement in World War I, U.S. involvement in World War II, and the Great Depression in the different laws that we see. For example, the New Deal, if we were going to associate this one, do all of you have an idea what the New Deal was? Go ahead and tell them what it is, and then we'll say which does it reflect.
One of the things that I think you need to know about the New Deal, it is not one law. Okay, this is another thing that I was a full-grown adult before I realized. It is a series of laws that have to do with public works projects, financial reforms, regulations. It created things like the WPA to put people back to work. That's what the little graphic is about. The Social Security Administration, the reason your grandparents get a little money when they retire, Social Security Administration. Provided support for farmers, unemployed people, the elderly, the young. They were trying to just help anybody because everybody was so desperate. It included both laws passed by Congress as well as executive orders. There's a big conglomeration of laws and executive orders.
Look at
Okay, Jamie's got some more information about it.
Just to see how many. I was shocked when I looked at this. These were things that were happening. The Emergency Banking Relief Act, the fireside chat, which the president gave, which was establishing, so your government does not intend that the history of the past few years shall be repeated. We do not want and will not have an epic of bank failures.
One of the things, there was this constant argument our government has had between when should the government step in, when should the private sector take care of it. And the previous administration had been private sector, private sector, private sector. And that's why he had to come in and say, no, the government is gonna do something about this, because obviously it's not working the other way.
Yeah, and see,
So-
Beer and Wine Revenue Act, does that sound familiar? But this act actually was getting rid of prohibition. So, but they said, well, maybe if we just tax these, we can
Yeah.
bring back. Yeah, so it's kind of, but there's your civil conservative and the federal emergency relief. And all agricultural act, adjustment act. And
And these are things like federal emergency relief. We still have FEMA to this day, things that we rely on, things we take for granted were not the case before the New Deal was passed.
And look at all of these things. This is all done under one president. His first 100 days, he did this. It's
Oh, sorry.
yeah, so Tennessee Valley Authority, the Security Act of 1933. This one, the National Park Service, homeowners loan, Banking Act of 1933, which was keeping its promise from the radio, federal deposit. I mean, you can go through and just look at, this is done in chronological order.
A massive amount of
See,
legislation
look,
went into the New Deal.
Yeah, just look at how many, and then the part two, the second New Deal. So we're not even getting, and it has infrastructure. So some of these things we see repeated in law.
Don't talk a lot about, but you will want to pay attention to is conservation laws. Things like the Clean Water Act. We don't have a lot of extra slides on those, but it is one of the things to pay attention to is the soil conservation, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. Fights about, environmental legislation. So, one of the trends if you're studying for this test, one of the trends you'll want to look for is environmental legislation, which was even part of the New Deal.
Yep. And so that's really good. So back to the PowerPoint. I will leave it here. Ta-da! I didn't think I could do that.
Yeah, we'll send it to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll send it to everybody.
Yeah, and going to the next slide. The Japanese internment. No,
Okay. Oh, go ahead.
yeah, you can go, but this is one of the things when I said there's bad things and there's, good things that our government did. This is one of those things I think was horrible. And notice that the 9066 is an executive order.
Yeah.
Times of war, the sedition was time of war. Patriot Act, time of war. Japanese internment, time of war. So these things help you try to remember what's going on.
And one of the reasons we picked this one is it had both an executive order and a Supreme Court decision. An executive order that said, we're going to insure all of these Japanese people. We're going to send them to relocation centers. Okay. And then this gentleman, Korematsu, sued. Well, actually, he didn't sue. He just didn't go. They said, show up. He didn't show up. He got arrested. He said, this violates my civil rights. And the Supreme Court said, no, actually, it's not based on race. It is a legitimate security risk. It is done for reasons of national security. So once again, in times of war, national security tends to trump civil liberties.
And interestingly, at the same time, people who were Germanic or German were not put in internships. So internment. So that's something to look at in our history. Often the bad guy is not white Anglo-Saxon. So that's another issue. Okay, so now we're moving up to 1949 to 1999. This may be still before you guys, but I remember the Vietnam War. Anybody here remember the Vietnam?
I was born right
I
after.
was born, but
Yeah, you do.
yeah, but not that the Vietnam War, yes, but not that I know much about what happened.
Yeah, so I was living when we had the kids complaining in the schools. We had sit outs just like we were trying to copy the college students. I was in high school at this time. And so we would have sit-ins, it's wrong. I had a puzzle skirt that they, and the long hair. I was like a hippie, a little hippie, a Jamie hippie. Anybody there, remember the Civil War? Do we have all young people?
Okay, civil rights.
I mean, Vietnam War, Vietnam
Yeah.
War.
Hopefully none of them remember the Civil War. We got a vampire.
War.
Yeah, 'cause in our heads.
Yeah, I remember it. So, and then look, we have another resurgence of the civil rights movement. So throughout our history, we're having take away, push and pull between citizen rights and what we want to give to the government. So there's something I'm sure you want to add to this.
Well, actually, if you'll go to the next slide, because it's kind of where we're talking about civil rights again. And you'll notice, now, one thing I will point out, we listed 3 Supreme Court decisions here. There were probably 15, on the study guide, there are probably 15 Supreme Court decisions just in the late 60s or through the 60s, late 50s, 60s, 70s, things having to do with desegregation, legal counsel, abortion rights, voting rights, voting age being lowered, affirmative action, all of this stuff taking place, all having to do with the expansion of civil rights from the late 50s through the mid 70s, probably.
Yeah.
You'll see a lot, all of this sort of goes together, and a lot of it was done in the Supreme Court. Remember I said, you'll notice, like at the beginning, everything was done in the legislature. Now, so many more things are being done through the Supreme Court.
So different times in history, different places have more power.
Yeah.
Yeah, but notice here, I think this is when we were talking about president and war. And that you always remember the president, this is one of his powers in the Constitution. He is the commander in chief of the army. And here we see an executive order to send the National Guard to support desegregation. So I don't know if this was the first time that happened where the National Guard was actually.
Yeah, I don't know. I did not look at that.
Yeah,
but-
because I know like the whiskey, when they made the Whiskey Act, people in farming communities, they like to make whiskey. And the militia was sent, but it was sent by a state. So I don't know if it counts, you know.
Can I
if it's
ask a
sent-
question here? In which case did they deploy NG to support desegregation?
That's actually, we actually have a whole slide on that.
Okay.
So Brown versus, this is another slide where we have 2 things going on. We had Brown versus the Board of Education that said separate but equal educational facilities for racial minorities is inherently unequal. And then the white parents in the southern states had what is commonly known in the South as a hissy fit, and said that they were not going to integrate the school. And so this is a Norman Rockwell painting, a very famous one of the National Guard escorting Ruby Bridges to school in Arkansas. And so in 1957, President Eisenhower sent federal troops to maintain order and peace while the integration of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas took place.
And then notice the date here is 1957. So most people think this wasn't a real idea. Why do people make such a big deal about these things? I graduated in 1974. They integrated our high school in 1970. We
So
had
it took
race
13
riots.
years.
And I was in the Chicago area.
Yeah.
I was in Illinois. I was in the land of Lincoln, no less. And they just didn't want that high school to be integrated. They were upset. We had, if you didn't belong to a gang, we were in the ungang. We had gangs of black and white students in a gang, but there were white gangs, black gangs fighting each other. And so they had to have police. We had tear gas in the lunchroom. It was a terrible time. So don't just think this stuff happened in the South. And don't think it was all settled in 1957.
Right.
It's still not set. It's still not set. I can see
Right.
your face. Yeah. Now we can.
Okay. So we really did go really fast, Jamie.
I told you we could.
We could have had more. So we have moved into our lifetimes, okay? This slide goes off into the future.
We were in my life.
Well, these younger folks' lifetime. Okay.
I'm old.
Yes, but we're all still here. And so this is the current era. And the two things that we see is that we have a lot of legislation about are the September 11th attacks. And then just, I put 2019 to whenever, not over yet, the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, so we have legislation having to do with those things, executive Supreme Court decisions. Jamie, you want to talk about any of this? Because I did not expand on this slide.
Yeah, because we had this is, like I
Mhm.
mentioned, the Patriot Act. Again, we have a war. It's not a war. It's a first attack on American soil by a foreign entity. And this was really rough. So I don't know how many people listened to the speech that President Bush gave, but he was almost making it like a crusade. And he used that to write the Patriot Act. Many people, like myself, felt that they were taking away our civil liberties. And I wasn't alone. If you guys go and you want a history of your library books, you're going to find you don't have a copy unless you have it out right now. Do you know why that is? Back for the day. During this time, under the Patriot Act, they were telling the libraries they needed to give paper on anybody that read specific books. Now, they don't like censorship of books, let alone we're going to turn in a list of what they call us patrons. So at that time, every library in the United States, they stopped keeping a history of the books you read in the past. And it was a direct reason because they disagreed with that part of the Patriot Act. Small fact, but you see how
Yeah.
these things.
And one
So
thing,
which one was the picture?
the Patriot Act was in
and
2001.
they kept doing it and they use it to spy on people through the
Mhm.
internet.
There is a slide about the Patriot Act. I wanted to talk for a second. I do a whole slide on it on DACA. One of the things you'll notice currently is that if we can't get something done in the legislature, presidents are apt to take matters into their own hands. The country as a whole has been trying to get a handle on immigration since that Alien and Sedition Act in 1798. The legislature has not done job, I'll be blunt, has not done its job in taking care of immigration. And so even though he could not solve all of immigration, President Obama in 2012 passed the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And so this is actually, if you look at the last, I should have printed the list. If you look at the beginning of the country's history, each president has like 2 executive actions. If you look, probably find it from Roosevelt on. Okay,
I have a chart.
yeah. See, George Washington had like,
Oh, I like the chart. Why did they take
where did the chart go?
the chart? Yeah, when I pressed it, it said 57 rows, and then when I do it.
Okay, so just hit the more rows button. Oh, it still did it. Down at the bottom or anything?
Oh,
there we
that
go.
was good.
Okay, so you'll see that,
But
can you go to the top just so I can see what the columns mean?
Yeah.
Total orders and years in office. Okay, so like George Washington had 8, but then the second one, Madison only had 1. John Quincy Adams had 3. Andrew Jackson, had 12, but then William Henry Harrison didn't bother. So you see that they're not doing a lot for executive action. Then you have Grant, but he is in the post-Civil War era. There's lots going on. So he passed a lot of executive actions. And you'll notice that the averages are getting higher. But then these Roosevelt boys,
Oh my God.
you know, no, that's Teddy.
Oh, it was.
That's not even FDR yet. Yeah.
Oh, my goodness, yeah.
And you see the averages are getting higher, leading into, then Franklin, scroll up to Franklin, over three, whoop, went the wrong way. Oh, wait,
You said,
Yeah.
oh, I am just like.
3,000, almost 4,000 executive actions, all that New Deal stuff, as Jamie was just saying.
They have a Congress or Congress not from their party, not their party.
Yeah, but that's the thing, well, if you have a bubble, if you had bubbles of power, okay, you would see that, you know, it starts off.
If you write it there, the people online can't.
Oh, rat.
Whiteboard here, but I didn't.
I don't know how to do it.
Okay.
So I'll just try to talk about it. If you had the bubbles of power, at the beginning, you would see that the legislature has a big bubble, and the executive and the judiciary have bubbles. And at different times, different ones have expanded and retracted, always trying to, it's called checks and balances. They're always trying to keep each other in check. And they're doing things like saying, you're not doing your job, so I'm going to do it for you. Okay. So these, the number of executive actions grows and grows throughout the country's history.
Yeah, and when did COVID start? Because you notice the Economic Stimulus Act.
That was 2008 after the big housing crash.
So this was the first, when we had an inflation under Obama, and then.
No,
the
Obama
Affordable Care.
inherited
Yeah.
the poor economy.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And then-
Inherited the bad economy. That
Right.
was,
Yeah.
Stimulus Act was to help the
Right.
industry.
right. that's
And then
right.
the Affordable Cares Act did get through Congress. Okay, these are actual legislative actions. And then the CARES Act in 2020 dealing with COVID-19.
Yeah.
Okay, things like giving extra money to schools to pay for cleaning supplies and computers so people can work from home.
Yeah, and then this is something I find interesting about our Supreme Court decisions as we're moving to our modern period. These things came about because of individuals or entities other than a state.
Right.
So at some of these legislation of same-sex marriage, a lot of the Supreme Court cases come from people, owners of a business, against somebody that says that you were discriminatory towards me. And those are things that the Supreme Court would do. So we see more individual, I think more individual involvement than we did in the past.
Another thing that's interesting, talking about sort of trends, there's not been a constitutional amendment passed since 1993. And it's like the harder it is to get something done, the less of it we've done. It's really, really hard to get passed. You have to have 2/3 of the states agree to an amendment. But an executive action, the president can just say, boom, this is what we're going to do. Now, sometimes those executive actions then go to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court says, yes, no, maybe so. Okay.
Yeah, in fact, the Affordable Care Act, which was legislation, was taken to the Supreme Court.
Multiple times, bits and pieces of it were declared unconstitutional.
And the deferred, the DACA was also taken to the Supreme Court.
And this Patriot Act has been taken to the Supreme Court multiple times. Once again, some pieces of it declared constitutional, other pieces declared unconstitutional. And I think our last slide is about the Patriot Act. Yeah.
Sounds so good.
It was enacted after September 11th and the 2001 anthrax attacks. When we talk about times of government intervention, times of fear, people were most of you, or 2/3 of you, are probably too young to remember the September 11th attacks. But people were very, very afraid. And when people are afraid, government to look strong. So we passed they passed this legislation, tightening national security, particularly as it related to foreign terrorism. It extended surveillance. It made it easier for agencies to talk to each other, and it increased penalties for terrorism. And it suspended the rights of many people who were arrested during that time. If it was something that could be considered terrorism, you didn't have the same constitutional rights as a common street criminal in their idea. So
Yeah, so with this one, we, also, when they testing you on these ideas, this is a good example of where citizens gave up some of their rights to their government. And we talked about those ideas in the first.
when we talk about the social contract, when we talk about John Locke and the social contract and these Enlightenment ideals from way back at the beginning, that social contract is how much freedom am I willing to give up for government protection? That's really what the whole thing is about. So as you notice these, think about these things in trends. Don't it's the entire list of important Supreme Court decisions. You're probably not going to be able to memorize the entire list of even the amendments. Is hard for some people to remember. But if you think of big trends, if you think, okay, war times, limiting of civil rights. If you think times of peace, expansions of civil rights after the Civil War, during the 1860s and the 1960s, of civil rights. What other trends? Who's making the decisions? Is it the Supreme Court? Is it the states? Is it the federal government? Is it the president? Is it the legislation? So kind of look at those trends too. Early on, more legislative decisions. Later, more executive and Supreme Court decisions. So
I wanted to go back.
okay.
Yeah, we can look at now the trends might I would do slide from current slide. Can you guys see the slide from the current slide out there in Zoom? I just put the list of the trends up. Can you see it? You have to do something by mouth.
Yes.
Oh, you see it? Yes?
Have they all gone to sleep? Have we bored them to death?
No, they're chatting,
Oh.
and I want to just say by mouth, anybody.
Say, yes, I can see landmark legislation.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
You're our hero for the day.
Yeah, so these are now this might make more sense to you after we went through. When it talks about conflicts and compromises, we didn't do a lot about that, but one of the things we pointed to was called the Monroe Compromise. Obviously, it's a compromise, but you need to know what would that be a compromise of, and though you know what it is, yeah. So it has to do with slavery, and so
And the expansions and
yeah,
that.
so that would be, so that's why you want to look at those. Territorial expansion was the one kind of we picked as a trend. We picked expansion and restrictions of civil rights and liberties. You can see, like I was going to say, Katie said.
Yeah, Katie's fine.
Yeah, she said that when there's a war, you're probably going to lose civil rights. When there's not a war, those rights are given back. So you see that trend between it. Same thing, expansion of and restriction of social programs. This is a direct relationship to how well our economy is, because we don't want citizens with unrest. That could be terrible. So then you have environmental protections. And we saw this start with Roosevelt's big
New Deal.
the New Deal. But this has become a very modern issue, and so it might definitely be on the test. And then expansions of presidential and war powers. This is little by little, presidents try to push themselves to have more power.
And that's why we showed you that slide of, this president had 1 executive action, this president had 3,000 executive actions. It has expanded and expanded. as, presidents have just taken more power.
So here, and then these are the executive actions, which include stuff like executive orders. So go ahead, you want to do this one?
Just looking at, efforts at foreign policy, we talked about wars, ending wars, starting wars, territorial expansion. We didn't talk about the Louisiana Purchase a lot, but we did talk about the Adams onus. Those were executive actions. Once again, restriction and expansions of civil rights and liberties. Japanese internment was an executive action that was then upheld by a Supreme Court decision. But then enforcement of civil rights Supreme Court decisions, that was also an executive action. Some presidents were expanding those rights, some were shrinking them. Orders, things like affirmative action was an executive order. And then when we talked about it, when Roosevelt did his fireside chats that Jamie showed, that was not actual laws. That was him saying, hey, we need to pass these laws. Talk to your senator. Do what you need to do. He was drawing up support for these laws.
Is that the bully pulpit?
That's what the bully pulpit means. The bully pulpit means that the president, the only person in the country that can be on all the channels at the same time because he said so. The president has the ability to speak to everyone at once, and a law, he can argue for those laws in a way that nobody else has the ability to. He gets to get the whole Congress and the whole country together once a year for the State of the Union address and his inaugural address. And these are things everybody to, and that's why it's called the bully pulpit.
Yeah.
No senator can do that. Senator can't say, I'm going to talk to the whole country at once, but the president can.
Well, and it seems today less powerful as far as the bully pulpit, because you got to remember when they had a radio, you had to have you either paid for that radio time or you were the president and you got to be on. But today you can see Ted Cruz on YouTube.
Right.
You can. Fox News always has senators on,
or you can watch, a movie on Netflix during the State of the Union address.
State of the Union.
You don't have it's the bully pulpit is not as strong as it once was.
Yeah, because of the way our media works today. Yeah.
Yeah, we no longer just have 3 channels that the president takes over.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember when we were kids, it was on all, when the president talked, he was on every channel. Yep. And today, like she's saying, you can go to here and
You
there.
can watch Netflix,
Yeah, we didn't have any options. So if you were watching TV, you were watching the president. Yeah. And then his war powers, the president has war powers. Yeah, and we saw a bit of that questionable with, I know when Obama was president, the NATO asked us to get involved in the war in Libya. And the legislature didn't want to give him that power. But because it was NATO, he took money. The legislature said, well, you can do it, but you can't pay for it. But he had discretionary money. He used the discretionary money and paid for the planes that were over Libya. That was a game changer in that war.
And even in the last 2 years, President Biden came into office, and what was the first thing he did? Anybody know? War powers. He took all the troops out of Afghanistan. He walked in the door and he said, we're done with this war. This war that's been going on for 20 plus years. But that's because he's the commander in chief. He gets to do that. So these are, thinking of these things holistically. Do we have any questions from the Zoom folks?
And now I'm showing you all so you can actually use the chat if you want. And I'll open up the chat because I see, and anybody who has not put their name, their email and name in the chat, please do, because we're going to be using it later.
Click on chat.
Oh yeah, I didn't do that.
Yes, we will be
Oh, yeah.
sending the recording to everyone. The 3 previous sessions, I think, are now up on the Learning Commons website.
Oh, cool. Do we know where?
I couldn't find it the other day.
And I'll find out where it is. and
Yeah.
When we send the link for this,
We'll send a link for the other 3 as well.
That's gonna be real. Yeah, we'll send a link, not the recording, because this recording will be very large
Mhm.
when they record on Zoom. So we always send the link to it and then you can watch it. You can watch it 100 times if you want.
Yes. We will also send you the study guide that we base our PowerPoints on, and we will send you the sample test. Okay?
Has
So-
anybody taken it a first time?
Yes.
Yeah, when you took it,
First part of it.
oh, did you get it? I want to get a question. I
Yeah.
wanted to know, what were your feelings on the test?
Yeah, sorry, Jamie.
Yeah. Anybody out there in Zoom world, have taken the test? I just want to get a feel for what you felt about the test. Because it would be interesting to know if the sample test is similar to the real test. And I would love to take that test. I'm gonna, yeah. Yeah, how about you? What were your feelings with
Favor? What were you've taken the test?
I've never taken.
Oh, you have not taken
oh,
it?
nobody took it. So
Okay.
nobody in the group took it yet. So we can't
Okay.
bleed you guys. So no questions, any questions? Oh,
You took it?
the sample test we're gonna send to you by email. I thought I sent
When
it
is
to
the
you.
next step?
Simone, I thought I sent it to you on a link. When I sent you an email, this is Jamie. It would have been one of the things I attached to your email. I can re-email it because I recognize your name. Yeah. Now, usually I email this, when I send the link for one of the programs that we watch, I always send where the study guide and the sample test with it.
And there'll be links to the Florida Department of Education.
And I actually send the documents.
Yeah,
PDFs.
okay. Oh, you do?
I send
Okay.
the actual PDF, so they don't need to go.
Go to the link.
Yeah,
Okay.
because DOE changes stuff all the time.
Okay.
It drives me crazy. Any audience that is physically in the room? Now, any questions from the people that are outside the room in Zoom land? Yeah, because we can close up. We have 3 minutes left if
Yeah.
there's no questions. And
Thank you guys for coming though. And like I said, if you missed the first 3 and want to get the live version, we'll start them again at the end of January and they will be online.
Yep.
All right. I think we can probably close it up.
Okay.
Bye, guys.
Bye, guys. My pleasure, Adam. We love this. Yeah, we love doing this. And
Mhm.
everybody in the Zoom has put their first and last name, right? I mean, their email, right? Because once I close it, I can't get it. It'll be finished.
Thank
1,
you, Adam.
2, 3.
Okay, bye-bye.